Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations International Labor Organization, commonly called ILO? What is the ILO doing to work with various groups such as employers, labor, as well as governments to focus on major issues such as youth employment? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today, we're taking a look at one of the really major issues around the world, and that is youth employment, and what one United Nations agency is doing to try to alleviate these problems. My guest today is an expert on this issue. My guest today is Mr. Charles Dan. Mr. Charles Dan is the International Labor Organization's Special Representative for Youth and Social Inclusion. Mr. Charles Dan, welcome to Global Connections Television.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into this very important issue shortly, but let's talk a little bit about the International Labor Organization. When was it formed? Why was it formed? What's its major mission?
The International Labor Organization, that we call ILO, was founded in 1919. So we are going to celebrate the centenary of this organization in 4 years from now. The International Labor Organization is a very specific organization in the agency, in the United Nations system, because it groups three components. The first is the government. The second is the employers, represented by their central organizations of employers throughout the world. And the third component is the trade unions, the workers' organizations. And they form what we call the tripartism. So the ILO is a tripartite organization, and the ILO groups currently 185 member states. And as I said, it's what we call the tripartite organizations. In a nutshell, the governments, the employers, and the workers together to address the labor and social issues.
Mm-hmm. And that's so important to have all the players at the table. And that's a very unique tripartite arrangement, as you mentioned.
And it's indeed, and this is why it's important, because the very idea actually is that nobody can do it alone. Mm-hmm. And very often the problem that we face becomes even more difficult when you don't have all the partners and stakeholders around the table. Mm-hmm. And this is precisely what the ILO is trying to do, to have all the relevant actors of the economy around the table in order to address issues that are really important. And we cover a vast array of issues, going from employment creation, including youth employment that you mentioned, but also issues like child labor, forced labor, social dialogue, social protection. So we cover all these kind of issues in order to promote what we call decent work, access to decent work, which means the opportunity for every woman and man to have to have access to a productive and decent job.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this is how the ILO works with these three entities to develop labor standards by bringing them together and to work on in an atmosphere where they all are key players. Let's talk a little bit about the four objectives. We'll get into them in more detail, but just very briefly, what are the four strategic objectives of the International Labor Organization?
As I said, the idea is to promote what we call decent work. Mm-hmm. And to be decent, it means that we should not accept any kind of jobs. Jobs have to be based on some rights. We need to protect workers' rights. This is very important, and this is the first objective of the International Labour Organization, to promote and respect workers' rights. But the second objective is that to be able to protect workers' rights and employment rights, you need to have job first. So it's very important to be able to create jobs. And this is why the second objective of the organization is precisely to help those who create the jobs to be in a position to do so in promoting a favorable environment, including in particular for the private sector, for the private enterprises who create most of the jobs in the world. The third objective is social protection. When you work, it's very important that in case of an accident, in case of any injury, it's very important that you get a minimum of protection. And this is what we call social protection. And what we promote is the idea that when you get a decent job, it will be important for your employer to be able to contribute, but it will be also important for you as a worker to contribute. And social protections include the coverage stemming from injury to retirement, to pension funds. And the fourth objective is that in order to realize of these three objectives, namely workers' rights, employment creation, and social protection, it is important to get all the partners and the stakeholders around the table to be able to discuss, and this is what we call social dialogue, meaning the opportunity to discuss the issue with those who are directly involved, the government, the employers, and the workers.
Exactly. And this is a challenge for you and for everyone involved in this field. When you're talking about the first one, to protect workers' rights, and the third one, I think, was to have the safety nets, the social security nets, so to speak. These are so important. We see, though, in some countries, I only speak for the United States right now, but is there a trend in other countries where they're trying, some groups are trying to diminish those rights, or trying to basically shred those safety protections like unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, different things like that? There's a major movement in the United States to do that. Is that happening in other parts of the world?
It's definitely happening almost everywhere, because the countries are all facing a different level, but they are all facing an economic crisis. And when you are facing an economic crisis, and when you are in the private sector, when you run an enterprise, of course, the idea is that you will be tempted to see where you can make savings. But what we say at the level of the International Labour Organization is precisely that you should see workers' rights as an asset. It is very important to protect your worker if you expect more productivity from him or from her. And this is the same from social protection. Social protection should be seen as an investment in productivity rather than a cost. And this is why we promote the idea that precisely when the times are becoming difficult, when you are facing a crisis, this is precisely at this moment that you should see workers' rights and social protection as an investment in your workforce.
Exactly.
And not at the cost.
Exactly. And there's a large body of economic scientific information that indicates that one of the reasons, for example, we'll just use the United States since we're sitting here, that the U.S. economy grew so well was because of labor unions, because of the fact that workers had a right to bargain collectively, that they had a right to raise their standard of living and to be paid a fair sum. As you said, decent work, decent pay for decent work.
Absolutely.
And of course, today, well, really over the past several years, there's really been a hollowing of the middle class in the United States, where a large part of the money or a large part of the resources and the really the financial rewards have gone to a very small percentage, like 1% of the people. But you say this is an international trend.
This is definitely an international trend. But what is very important is that it is key to invest in the real economy. When you invest in the real economy, you will invest in the real actors of the economy. Contrary to the idea that you will put too much emphasis on the financial dimension of the economy. If you want a sustainable development, if you want your economy to be able to perform in the long run, then it is very important to rely on those who create the wealth, fundamentally. And those who create the wealth, fundamentally, are the workers. And this is why it is important to invest in them. And when we mean investing in them, as I said, it means protecting them. As I said, it means caring about their rights, but it also means investing in their training and retraining. And this is where the private sector also has a role. They have a role in being part of the education and training system of any country. Once again, this is very important if we care about the sustainability of what we are doing.
And sustainability is absolutely correct, because so many economists are saying the system is unsustainable at the rate we're going. Things are going to have to change, or there could be a collapse. There could actually be a collapse, and then everyone would suffer. But let's, I know you've been here all week, involved in a very high level demographic dividend and youth employment conference at the high level conference at the United Nations. Well, first off, what is demographic dividend, and what does that term mean, and what was the thrust of this conference?
Demographic dividend means that at one stage, the problems that we have in many countries is that the rate of the population is growing and growing and growing. And for instance, this is the case in Africa. When we talk about demographic dividend, it means that we need to invest in women and in girls' education, because we have also to help them to get empowered, to control their life, which means to be able also to be in a position to really say what number of children do they want. Because, of course, because very often when you get very large family, this is out of lack of information and out of lack of education. And it has been calculated, and it has been the case in many Asian countries, but also in some Latin American countries like Brazil, that when you are able to control the reproduction through a better education, a better planning system, you will get what we call the demographic dividend, which means that you will be able to, you will be in a position to get a better workforce, more educated, more productive, because every family will be in a position to afford a better education for their children. It's very different if you have 5, 7, 10 children, rather than if you are able to control the number of children that you can have. But the demographic dividend is when you reach a stage where you have an increase in the population, but this population at the same time is able to be productive. to get education and to get access to a decent work. But it's not automatic. It's not because you have a lot of people in a country that you will be able to get this dividend. To be able to get this dividend, it's very important to focus on three things. The first is health, including reproductive health. The second is education. You need to invest in your population, in particular the youth, including girls and young women. And the third is that it's very important to develop access and opportunities to decent jobs.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Our viewers are invited to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to look at previous shows, to look at this show and comment on it, and to perhaps make suggestions for future topics and future guests. Today, we're taking a look at the United Nations International Labor Organization and the unique role it plays in focusing on issues such as youth employment and many others. My guest today is an expert on the ILO. My guest today is Mr. Charles Dan. Mr. Charles Dan is the International Labor Organization's Special Representative for Youth and Social Inclusion. Mr. Dan, we're talking about really a potpourri of issues and challenges that are confronting, I would say, almost every government, every group in the world, come right down to it. You were talking about the situation with women, empowering women, and this is so very, very critical. We saw that the UN Millennium Development Goals, I think it was the third Millennium Development Goal, was to empower women. The new Sustainable Development Goals, I believe there's 17 of them or something like that. There are components in there for women. You mentioned how important it is. Are we making progress in this area? Do you see that women are becoming more empowered economically, becoming more empowered politically, culturally, just on across the board?
When it comes to empowering women, young women and girls, I would say that we will never do enough. Mm-hmm. We will never do enough to empower women and to promote gender equality. I think that this is a collective. This is both a collective challenge and it should be a collective endeavor. Nobody can do it alone, and we cannot leave it, of course, only to women to promote this cause. I think that it should concern all of us. But the key thing is that it's not only important for moral reason, because we are all equal, but it is also the smarter thing to do. It is good economics to empower women, because it means that we will be able to develop the production and the productivity in our economy. So the key thing is to remember is that it's not only the thing that we should do for moral reason, this is also the smarter thing we can do for economic reason.
Exactly. Now, we talked earlier about youth employment. I mentioned that a couple of times. How pervasive is this challenge with youth employment, unemployment, and maybe even underemployment? How pervasive is that around the world?
I think this is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and if I say so, this is because it involves not only our present, but it also involves our future. When we look at the figures, in 2014, there were 201 million people unemployed in the world. 201 million people without any job in the world. And out of these 201 million people, you have 74 million young women and men unemployed, which means almost 40% of this young unemployed. But when you look at the unemployment rate, you will see that the youth unemployment rate represents 13%, which is almost 3 times the unemployment rate of adult. But the most difficult thing is that even when we talk about unemployment, this is only the visible part of the iceberg. Because in many countries, people don't even have access to formal jobs. So a problem which is even more important is the vulnerable employment and the informal economy. And for instance, in the world, there are 228 million young women and men who earn less than $2 a day. These are those that we call the vulnerable workers. And beyond the vulnerable workers, you also have young people who are involved in hazardous jobs. And you will find 47.4 million young women and men involved in hazardous jobs. So when you look at the figures, it is very, very important, because today we have the largest generation of young people in the world that we have ever had in the world. And it is very important to be in a position to give them access to jobs, because every year throughout the world, all over the world, you have 40 million young people, young women and men, who will join the labor market every year. So it means that normally we should be in a position to give a job every year to 40 million additional people. And when you add these people to those who currently don't have a job, it means that in the next 10 years, the global economy would need to create 600 million jobs. This is the challenge we are confronted with.
Exactly. And of course, our viewers can go to your website, www.ilo.org, for more information. What you're talking about is, it sounds like a demographic time bomb. We have to provide employment opportunities for these young people. What is currently being done by the ILO, the International Labor Organization, as well as the international community, the private sector, the labor organizations, to help create these 600 million future jobs?
We are in a few months from now, in September, as you mentioned earlier, the United Nations will adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. For the time being, 17 goals are proposed. And it is also proposed that in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, there should be a global action for youth employment. And at the level of the United Nations systems, all the agencies are currently working on a global initiative to promote youth employment. When it comes to the International Labour Organization, what we do is that we say that nobody can do it alone. And this is why in June 2012, our members, coming from 185 member states, adopted a global call for youth employment, which is basically saying that it would be very important to focus on the macro dimension, which means that we should place employment creation and including youth employment creation at the center of the economic and social policies. It should not be seen as an afterthought or as a byproduct of the economic and social policies. But when countries are designing their economic and social policies, they should start by thinking how they will create employment and place it at the center of their concerns and the measures that they are taken. It's also important to focus on labor market measures. It's also important to focus on education and training. And it's also important to place a key emphasis on entrepreneurship, including youth entrepreneurship and self-employment. And lastly, we should never forget workers' rights, rights at work.
Exactly. Well, the last minute we have, let me ask you probably the toughest question. Why is it so dangerous, or is it dangerous to exclude, socially exclude this large number of young people for many reasons, for them not being able to achieve their self-actualization, to achieve the goals? But why is that so dangerous? I know it's a tough question, but we're just about out of time.
It's a question for everybody, for the ILO, but for the and also for the United Nations, but also for all the countries. You just cannot let down your youth. People cannot just be there doing nothing. We should never forget that the Arab Spring started because of one person, a vendor in the informal economy who was not allowed to do something to earn his life. We should never forget that if we multiply this single person by millions of young people, we should not be surprised if it becomes a political bomb. And this is why this is not at all a fatality. It's possible to address this issue, but for this, it's important to get together and to act together.
Well, Mr. Charles Dan, these are very important issues you're dealing with, and the International Labor Organization is a very unique entity. And of course, our guests can go to www.ilo.org to get more information on what you're doing and many of the issues we talked about today. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for joining us on today's Global Connections program.